Whispers in the night. It was a dark and stormy night, the kind of night that made you want to stay indoors, safe and warm. But for Emily, it was a night of desperation. She had been driving for hours trying to make it to her sister's house before the storm got worse. She had never been to this part of the country before, and the winding roads and dense forest made her uneasy. As she drove, the rain came down harder, the windshield wipers struggling to keep up. The wind howled, and she could feel the car being buffeted by the gusts. And then, without warning, the road disappeared. Emily slammed on the brakes, but it was too late. The car skidded off the road and came to a stop, half in a ditch. Emily's heart was pounding as she looked around, trying to make sense of what had just happened. The rain was coming down in sheets now, and she could barely see anything outside. She tried to start the car, but the engine wouldn't turn over. She was stranded. She looked at her phone, but there was no signal. She was completely cut off from the outside world. Emily knew she had to get out of the car and find help. She grabbed her coat and opened the door, stepping out into the rain. The forest around her was dark and foreboding. She could hear the rustling of the trees in the wind and the occasional crack of a branch. She started walking, trying to find some sign of civilization, but the rain made it difficult to see, and she stumbled over roots and rocks. As she walked, Emily began to feel like she was being watched. She would turn around, but there was never anything there. She told herself it was just her imagination, but the feeling persisted. Eventually, she came to a clearing. There was a small cabin nestled among the trees. Emily hesitated, but she knew she had no other choice. She approached the door and knocked. There was no answer. Emily knocked again, but still, no one came. She tried the door, and to her surprise, it was unlocked. She pushed it open and stepped inside. The cabin was dark, but she could make out a few pieces of furniture. There was a table, a couple of chairs, and a bed in the corner. She called out, but there was no answer. She was alone. Emily decided to stay in the cabin until the storm passed. She made herself comfortable on the bed and tried to get some rest. But she couldn't shake the feeling that she wasn't alone. She kept hearing strange noises like someone was moving around outside. Hours passed, and the storm showed no signs of letting up. Emily was getting restless. She decided to explore the cabin, hoping to find something to pass the time. As she looked around, she noticed something strange. The furniture was old, almost antique, and there was no sign of modern technology anywhere. No television, no radio, no phone. Suddenly, she heard a noise. It was coming from the other side of the cabin. She cautiously approached the sound, trying to be as quiet as possible. And then she saw it. In the corner of the room, there was a trapdoor. Emily had missed it earlier, but now it was open. She could see a set of stairs leading down into darkness. She felt a shiver run down her spine. She knew she should turn around and leave, but something drew her closer to the trapdoor. She descended the stairs, her heart pounding. The air was musty, and as she descended the stairs, her heart pounding, the air grew increasingly musty and damp. The darkness was overwhelming, and she could barely see her hand in front of her face. But as she reached the bottom of the stairs, she could hear something in the distance. A soft, muffled sound like someone was breathing. Emily moved slowly, feeling her way along the damp walls. The breathing grew louder, and she could hear something else now. A whispering, like a voice just out of reach. She couldn't make out what it was saying, but the tone was urgent, almost pleading. As she drew closer to the source of the sounds, Emily could see a faint glow in the distance. It was coming from a room at the end of a long, narrow hallway. She moved towards it, her heart racing. As she entered the room, she could see that it was filled with candles. The soft light flickered, casting eerie shadows on the walls. In the center of the room was a table, and on the table was a book. It was bound in leather, with strange symbols etched into the cover. Emily felt a sudden urge to touch the book, to open it and see what was inside. But as she reached for it, she heard the whispering again. It was louder now, and more urgent. She turned around, but there was no one there. She could see nothing but the flickering candlelight and the shadows dancing on the walls. Suddenly, Emily heard a sound behind her. She spun around, but there was no one there. And then she saw it. The book was open, and the pages were turning on their own. She watched in horror as the symbols on the cover began to glow, casting an eerie light on the room. And then she felt it. A cold, icy wind was blowing through the room, making the candles flicker wildly. The whispering grew louder, and Emily could hear something else now. A faint scratching sound, like something was trying to claw its way out of the darkness. She tried to run, but her feet wouldn't move. She was rooted to the spot, her heart pounding in her chest. The whispering grew louder, and she could feel something breathing on her neck. And then, with a sudden burst of energy, she broke free. She stumbled backward, tripping over her own feet. As she fell, she could see something moving in the darkness. A pair of glowing eyes, watching her with cold, merciless intensity. She scrambled to her feet and ran, her heart pounding in her chest. She burst through the door and up the stairs, not daring to look back. She could hear the whispering following her, getting louder and more urgent with each passing moment. Finally, she reached the top of the stairs. She pushed open the trapdoor and emerged into the cabin. She slammed the door shut behind her and collapsed onto the floor, gasping for air. The storm was still raging outside, but Emily knew she had to leave. She ran back to her car, slipping and sliding in the mud. She got in and started the engine, not daring to look back at the cabin. As she drove away, she could still hear the whispering in her ears. And she knew that she would never forget that night. The night she stumbled into a cabin in the woods and encountered something truly evil. Days turned into weeks, and Emily tried her best to forget about that fateful night in the cabin. But every time she closed her eyes, she could still see those glowing eyes and hear the whispering in her ear. One night, as she lay in bed trying to sleep, she heard the whispering again. It was louder than ever, and she could feel the cold breath on her neck. She sat up in bed, her heart racing, and then she saw it. The pair of glowing eyes watched her from the corner of the room. She could feel something cold and clammy on her skin, and she realized that the thing in the cabin had followed her home. Emily tried to scream, but no sound would come out. She could feel the creature getting closer and closer, and she knew that she had to do something before it was too late. She got out of bed and went to the kitchen. She knew what she had to do. She grabbed a knife and went back to her room. The creature was there, waiting for her. Its eyes glowed in the darkness, and Emily could see its razor-sharp teeth gleaming in the moonlight. With a sudden burst of energy, she lunged forward and plunged the knife into the creature's chest. It let out a horrible shriek and vanished into thin air. Emily collapsed onto the floor, panting and gasping for air. She knew that she had defeated the creature, but she also knew that it would never truly be gone. It would always be lurking in the shadows, waiting for its next victim. From that day on, Emily was never the same. She was haunted by the memory of the creature, and she knew that she would never be able to forget what had happened to her. She spent the rest of her days in fear, always looking over her shoulder and wondering if the creature was lurking just out of sight. And even now, years after her encounter with the creature, there are some who say that they can still hear the whispering in the darkness and feel the cold breath on their necks. They say that the creature is still out there, waiting for its next victim to stumble into its grasp.